asked for a meeting with Ehud Barak, and I sat with Ehud Barak and I presented him the draft for a long-term ceasefire. And Ehud Barak said, I'm skeptical, I don't believe we can trust Hamas, they won't keep to a ceasefire. But Barak, even though he said what he felt, created a very high-level committee of people from the Ministry of Defense, from the Army, from the intelligence, from the Shabak, from the Prime Minister's office, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this committee met over a period of about a month and a half to discuss the document, the proposal for a long-term ceasefire, and the idea of ceasefire with Hamas in general. At the end of that process, they essentially decided not to decide. Similarly, Ghazi Hamad had a same experience on Hamas side. He took the document and talked to people there, and there wasn't a yes, and there wasn't a no, and the situation continued with our periodic rounds of violence beginning. Every time a round of violence began between Israel and Hamas, these svavim, these cycles that we call, it always started the same way, it always progressed the same way, escalated the same way, and ended the same way. It always began with Israel claiming to have intelligence information about a terrorist cell organizing in Gaza that is imminently going to attack Israel. Imminently could mean a day, 2 days, a week, or a month. But there was hard information, intelligence information about organized terrorist attack against Israel, and the Israeli security thought that they have to take preemptive action against the cell, and they would use usually targeted killings to kill some people who were presumed to be in the preparation stages for an attack against Israel. That always led, by the way, those groups, those cells, were never Hamas. They were always some jihadi group, Islamic Jihad, Popular Resistance Committee, the Popular Front, other groups in Gaza that have names that are made up for a particular operation. It didn't matter. But what always happened is those smaller groups would begin shooting rockets at Israel, and Israel would respond. And for most of the last year and a half, 2 years, Hamas did not shoot rockets. They would sit on the side and let the other groups do the dirty work. And after a day or two of rocket fire, when the number of casualties on the Hamas side, on the Gaza side, would begin to climb, I would get phone calls from Ghazi Hamad, who would say, Gershon, we need to prevent the escalation, we need to have a ceasefire. I just spoke to the Prime Minister, I just spoke to Khalid Mashal, I just spoke to Abu Marzouk, I just spoke to Jabari. Everyone wants a ceasefire, we don't want escalation. And I would send the messages out to the Israeli side. At the same time, about that time, when they were ready for a ceasefire, the Egyptian intelligence people would step into the picture. I would be communicating with them, Ozzy would be communicating with them. We'd be sending messages back and forth. And after 2 or 3 days of rockets on fire, sometimes 4 days, we would get to a new ceasefire understanding, and Ahmed Jabari would send out his troops to impose the ceasefire on all the other factions. In the last couple of rounds, in fact it was March, I was in London at the time, and there was a major break in the ceasefire, and there were more than 20 casualties in Gaza, and the message that I got was that Hamas wanted a ceasefire, but they couldn't sit on the sidelines anymore, and they were on the brink of beginning to shoot rockets themselves, and that message went right back to Israel. It was something like 5 in the morning. When I got the phone call in London time, it was already 7 in the morning in Israel, and I passed on that message, and the Israelis agreed to stand down, and a ceasefire was imposed. The cycle after that, Hamas joined in the fire. The number of casualties increased, they joined in. According to what Hamas said, and according to what Israeli intelligence officials told me, the Hamas rockets were all targeted at open spaces. Some of them fell in the sea, a couple of the Hamas rockets even fell in Gaza. There was no attempt of Hamas to cause damage to those rockets. They were responding because they felt they had to respond. Now don't misunderstand me, we're not talking about a peace organization here in Hamas. We're talking about people who, when they want to, they take action to kill Israelis. And they would be very happy if during this past war, a rocket fell on this building and killed all of us sitting here. You heard how they cheered when rockets fell into them. Almost, they didn't fall. When rockets were sent to Tel Aviv and to Jerusalem. The point that I'm making is that it was very clear after repeated cycles of violence that Hamas wanted a long-term ceasefire, that Ahmed Jabri himself was interested in a ceasefire, that he imposed the ceasefire when he had to, and this was not for love of Zion, but for a realization that the tactics that they had adopted, the strategy of using rockets to attack Israel, was counterproductive. It ended up in extreme damage in Gaza with between 10 and 30 casualties in each round of violence, and no one getting killed in Israel and limited damage in Israel. And Jabri and other people who I call the more pragmatic wing of Hamas. Now notice I didn't use the word the more moderate wing of Hamas, but the more pragmatic wing of Hamas, came to the realization that they needed a timeout now to adjust their strategy, to figure out where they're heading, to find out what would serve their interest. And I thought, my own feeling was, that this was in the interest of Israel. That every day that people living in the south of this country and now in the center of the country could have without rocket fire, that's a day that we have to celebrate. Now, I knew in my talks with the Israeli officials when we talked about ceasefire, they stressed that having a ceasefire without eliminating the ability of Hamas to rearm itself and to rebuild its weapons was futile and not beneficial to Israel. So in the 5th version of the document, we added a paragraph that dealt with the issue of smuggling of weapons, and we made it in parallel to ending the siege on Gaza. Pretty much the same thing that came out of this last agreement. Looking at a parallel situation where Hamas would agree to close down the tunnels as long as their borders were open. Now, I was in Cairo last week. I met 4 times with the deputy head of the Egyptian military intelligence. We discussed this and other issues. That morning, everything that I do with my contacts with Hamas, I report to Israeli officials. In fact, a special channel was established by the Israeli side for me to communicate with them on a regular basis. The person who is my channel was sitting in the Kiryah all this past week, where all the decisions were being made. So this is the level of the contact that I have. And I reported to him I reported to him from Cairo about my meetings in Cairo. I reported to him when I came back from Cairo, and he knew that on Wednesday evening I would be receiving Ghazi Hamad's ceasefire proposal document. He called me early Wednesday morning and reminded me to send it to him as soon as I got it. I told him it would be in Arabic because Ghazi asked me what language I wanted in, and I told him I want the original Arabic version, not a translation. I got a phone call later that morning from the deputy head of the Egyptian intelligence, who said to me, he asked me if I got the document yet, and as soon as I would get it, to send it to him. And at 4 o'clock that afternoon, Ahmed Jabri was assassinated. Now, I don't want there to be any mistake. Ahmed Jabri was not assassinated because he had seen a ceasefire document, or because he supported the ceasefire document, or because he considered having a ceasefire document. I don't believe that Benjamin Netanyahu knew about the document, although I sent an SMS to the head of his office on Wednesday, Gil Sheffer, that I was expecting to receive this document later in the day, but I know that Gil Sheffer receives over 1,000 SMSs a day, and I imagine every time he sees my name, he just erases them anyway. But there were people in the Israeli system who knew that this document was on its way. Nonetheless, the decision to assassinate Jabri was made on the basis of the same prevailing opinion within the Israeli security that related to the document that I presented to Barak on May 1st. When I presented that document and they created the committee deliberated, and like everything in the army, opinions were divided into 3. One opinion supported mine, that said that there is a pragmatic trend within the Hamas movement, and by having a ceasefire with them, we can support those pragmatic people and help to build and strengthen the more pragmatic approach within Hamas. That was a minority opinion amongst the people who deliberated the possibility of ceasefire. The other opinion on the far other end of the scale were the people whose voice was heard and is still heard in Israel that says we don't negotiate with Hamas, we don't have a ceasefire with Hamas. The only thing that we have to do with Hamas is bring them down, replace the regime in Gaza by force if necessary. We have the ability to do it. We didn't do it in Oferet Yitzchak, we should do it now. The middle voice, the prevailing voice, and the voice that dictated what happened these last 8 days, was the voice that said, we don't negotiate with Hamas, we don't have a ceasefire with Hamas, we create deterrence. Ceasefire strengthens them. What we need to do is to make them scared of us. We need to rebuild the deterrence so that they will think 100 times before they attack us with their rockets. And that was the prevailing mood back in May, and that was the prevailing mood 8 days ago when they had an opportunity, based on intelligence information, to assassinate Ahmed Jabri. And the reason why Jabri was targeted is obvious as well. He was the most important military leader in Hamas, the head of Israel and Hamas, the most protected, the most cautious, the most brutal, perhaps, or thought to be, the biggest danger to Israel in terms of his experience, his knowledge, and his capability to hurt Israel, and the message they wanted to send to every single person in Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the Popular Resistance Committee and any other group was that if we can get Ahmed Yassin, no one has impunity. If we can get, if we can get Ahmed Jabri, no one is safe. This is the message they wanted to send to everyone in Gaza. And it worked, because the minute Jabri was killed, every single member of the Hamas leadership and the Jihad leadership and the other groups went underground. And they stayed underground during these past 8 days, everyone with the exception of Ismail Haniyeh, who remained the public face and received all the dignitaries who came to Gaza during this past week. All the other members of the Hamas, the Jihad, and other leadership were underground, and they were scared. And they were running for their lives, and that's the message that Israel wanted to send. And there were people in the Israeli system who thought that perhaps that would be enough to create the deterrence. But when they started shooting back with all their force, the Israelis knew that it wasn't enough, and then they went after the rocket launchers and the other infrastructure and individual commanders. They knew everything, and they knew everyone, and they knew where everyone lived. They blew up every house of every senior level commander of Ezra al-Qassam. And one of the things that Jabri did, and one of the reasons why he was so feared, I think, in Israel and other places, was because when he inherited Ezra al-Qassam, it was a loose grouping of cells that were mostly independent and secretive. Not everyone knew everyone else. And Jabri took this loose organization of a guerrilla army and created a fighting force with divisions and platoons and commanders and a chain of command and a disciplined army of between 12 and 15,000 soldiers. And he was the chief of staff. He was the Ramakal, and there was no argument about his position in doing this. He had a military mind, and he commanded with a military mind, and there was military discipline, and that's the characteristic of Jabri. He was also charismatic. He was a leader. He was very religious. During the Shalit negotiations, at a point when it seemed to the Israeli team that Jabri was just not capable of making an agreement, we sat one evening in a restaurant in Hod Sharon trying to figure out what we could do to convince Jabri to be more flexible. One of the ideas that came up naturally on the table by one of the team members was that Jabri was holding on to Gilad Shalit because he saw Shalit as a life insurance policy. So it was suggested that I, in my contacts with Razi Hamad, to talk to Jabri about what would be an acceptable exchange, a different kind of life insurance policy instead of Gilad Shalit. We could provide international guarantees that Israel won't touch Jabri, that he would remain alive. All kinds of things were proposed. And the answer that came back from Jabri was the following. He said, if I live or die, that's in the hands of Allah. My fate has been sealed. If Allah wants me to live, I will live. If Allah wants me to die, I will die. I'm not afraid to die. Gilad Shalit for me is not a life insurance policy because I don't need a life insurance policy, and it wasn't empty words. I spoke to some people from Gaza who knew Jabri very well in trying to understand who this person was. I spoke to some people who were with him in prison, in Israeli prison. When he was arrested, he was a member of Fatah. And in prison, he became religious, and after 2 years in prison, he asked the Israeli prison guards, with the agreement of the Palestinians, to move him from the Fatah wing, the Chiloni wing, to the religious wing of the prison, where Hamas and Jihad were. And that's where he was, and that's where he developed into a religious Muslim and became a leader in Hamas. Well, I don't know if the proposal that we made for a ceasefire would have worked. I really don't. I know that what we included on our proposal was not just that Hamas should observe a ceasefire, but it also had to impose it on the other groups. And it wasn't just keeping to a ceasefire, but it had to engage in preventive measures as well. And the proposal included a mechanism that we proposed, testing. A mechanism whereby the next time Israel has intelligence information about a cell organizing in Gaza to attack Israel, the information would be given to the Egyptian intelligence and then given to Hamas by the Egyptian intelligence, and they would have 24 hours or 48 hours, whatever was required, to prevent that attack without Israel coming in and killing them. If they did it, then we had an agreement. We had a validation that the agreement could work, and that Hamas and Jabri were ready to enforce it and to make it work. If it didn't work, well, Israel could go in there and do whatever they had to do anyway. And that's what I had to say about this option of going to war as well. We may not have had an option. We may not have had an option because the continued rocket fire on the civilian population of Israel was intolerable. It could not be accepted. It could not be continued. And it repeated itself more and more frequently with greater intensity, and the period of times between the ceasefires got shorter and shorter. So something had to be done. I believe that there was a possibility of a ceasefire before the war. There's no way of proving it now. There's no way of determining if I'm right or if I'm wrong. But in my opinion, the option of using force should be the very, very, very last option, and I don't think we got there. We never tried the option of engagement and dialogue. We never tried the option that I proposed and Razi Hamid proposed. And therefore, I believe very strongly, although I can't prove it, that we would have had a ceasefire before this war, that the ceasefire arrangement that we proposed would have been better and would have been longer lasting than the one that's currently made, although we have no way of knowing that. Maybe I'm wrong. Could very well be, but what I said, the option of using force was always there. If they didn't get Jabri last Wednesday, they could have gotten him next Wednesday. There would always be an opportunity, and I think we pulled the trigger too quickly. Now, who won? Obviously, in any situation like this, both sides come out saying we won.
Who cares?
No one, well, millions of civilians out there care because they rallied around their flag, whether it be a blue and white flag or a green flag. They all rallied around their flag. They all celebrated their troops and their bravery. They all rooted for the home team, and they all cheered when the rockets fell on the other side. Not all, some of us didn't, but most did. Most wanted a clear military victory, and both sides claimed that military victory. You can't take it away, and you can't convince them that they were wrong. With the Gilad Shalit story, I remember talking to members of Hamas when they were cheering that they got a deal to release 1,027 prisoners after 5.5 years, and they were really happy for achieving their great victory. And then I reminded them that during those 5.5 years, 3,000 people in Gaza were killed, and the whole entire Gaza economy and infrastructure was destroyed, and that was mainly because they were holding on to an Israeli prisoner. If that's victory, then I wonder how many victories like that they can afford to have. And I would suggest the same thing to the Palestinians of Gaza today. If this war was a victory for them, well, very strange victory. But I would say to Israel as well, we showed our military might. I would say the only real victor in this war is Rafael and the Iron Dome, and they're going to sell a lot of those units now. The war is going to be paid for over and over and over again. The Americans are going to buy 1,000 Iron Domes now, and every other country in the world will want to buy it. That's the only real victory in this war. Both people lost, in my view. The ceasefire arrangement that we all saw last night on the piece of paper was not an agreement between Israel and Hamas. There were no signatures. It's as much as a non-paper as any non-paper has ever been written. It is an understanding between Hamas and Egypt and between Hamas and Israel. There are parts of the agreement that were written and we saw. There are parts of the agreement that are very vague in terms of what they mean. I think it's the third paragraph that says in 24 hours we'll get together and talk about opening the borders, etc., etc. And this is very vague. I'm completely convinced that part of the unwritten agreement was an understanding between Israel, the United States, and Egypt, that Egypt will close the tunnels for smuggling of weapons in Sinai. The Israeli negotiator at the table was Tamir Pardo, the head of the Mossad. Tamir Pardo did not leave Egypt in those negotiations without an assurance that the smuggling of weapons into Gaza through the tunnels will not be closed. So I'm quite sure of that. I'm quite sure that Hamas also walked away from the table with an agreement from the Egyptians that the Rafah border will be opened and turned into a formal international border, meaning essentially politically that the Gaza Strip will attain some kind of semi-state status. That's the political outcome. Will the ceasefire last? Well, I'm not a prophet, and every day that it does last is an indication that we have created deterrence, and if they send rockets back into us on a regular basis, we know that we didn't create deterrence. Will force be the answer to create that deterrence in the future? Probably. But what really needs to happen, and with this I'll conclude, is what really needs to happen is that we need to engage Abu Mazen and the PLO in the West Bank and have a real negotiation for the establishment of a Palestinian state next to Israel that would say very clearly that the Palestinian state includes the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem as its capital. And when there is a regime in Gaza that accepts the term of the agreement, then it will be implemented in Gaza. But what we will be doing is giving the people in Gaza a reason to decide what regime they want. And if we were to take an additional step, which I don't understand why we don't take it, we all know that the 40-kilometer gap between the West Bank and Gaza will eventually be closed by some dedicated route, either a road, a tunnel, a bridge, a train. Those have all been investigated, researched, engineering plans, and pricing has been done on this. It's all ready to be used. A decision has to be made, and if I were the decision maker, I would start building that route today, and I would bring it to 1 kilometer short of Gaza. So not only would the people of Gaza see a peace treaty with an independent Palestinian state that could offer them freedom and liberation and a chance of prosperity, they would also see the physical connection between them and their state. And if it took the Egyptian people, after they broke the fear barrier, 18 days to overthrow a dictatorship regime of 30 years, I'm quite convinced that the people of Gaza, the reasonable people of Gaza, like Mohammed Abu Saleh that we heard, and he's one of many, many hundreds of thousands of reasonable Gazans, would make a decision to either force Hamas to change or to get rid of Hamas. Anyone who wants to do a regime change in Gaza, and I do, knows that the only way to do it effectively is politically, not militarily. We have the physical ability, the military ability to destroy the Hamas regime. But if we do that, it means that we reoccupy Gaza, and we are going to be soldiers, and our children are going to be soldiers in Gaza for a long time to come. We left Gaza because we didn't want to stay there anymore. To do an effective regime change, we have to give the Palestinian people in Gaza a choice. They have no choice today. That's what we need to do, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Gershon. I have many questions, but we'll take questions from the audience. Who would like to go? All right, so I'll start.
Not everyone at once.
Gershon, you said that in that committee there were three opinions, and the prevailing one was actually it's a position that it is not the first time that the Israelis took. Basically, let us pound them into fear or into submission. And this we've been seeing, from 1973, probably even before that. The type of very arrogant, I think very Western and not understanding the type of culture, not wanting to understand the culture, not wanting to show an understanding to the region that we're living in. And I'm just wondering, this is a question that is a greater question, not specifically on Gaza. Is it possible in your eyes that you have been so involved in trying to promote peace between Israelis and Palestinians for such a long time? Is it possible, first of all, do you think that it's possible to break that type of, to re-educate, to reformat the Israelis and the way they think on the one hand? And is it possible to reach a real peace if the Israelis don't change that scale? This past Friday, President Mohammed Morsi in a mosque in Cairo said that he is willing to a comprehensive peace of equals with anyone. And obviously, I think what he's referring to is the fact that we know that Ehud Barak, for instance, has been many people have said that he always comes and talks to Arabs from way up here down to low there. How do we break this connection?
First of all, Dan, you have to deal with reality that in a lot of circumstances it's worked. Balabait Ishtagya Lebanon. The landlord went crazy in Lebanon. We've had 6 quiet years along our northern border, and Hassan Nasrallah is still hiding underground. In 1974, we made an agreement with the Syrians after they got seriously beat up by us. We came very close to Damascus after they surprise attack in the Yom Kippur War. And our Syrian border has been the quietest border of Israel since 1974. That's deterrence. Deterrence works. What we have to do is transform the understanding, not that deterrence is not the way, but that there is no way to win this conflict militarily. You don't achieve peace with deterrence. You achieve peace by engagement, by talking, by respect, by understanding the needs and the interests of the other side and meeting your own needs and interests through a dialogue and negotiation and arriving at an agreement that serves both sides. I'm not 100% convinced that it's just a cultural issue. There is an element of cultural issue, there's no doubt in my mind. Israel, with its mixed fabric of society, with people coming from all over the world, being Eastern and Western, Israel is a Western country. Our orientation is toward Europe and the United States. That's the part of the world that we identify with, that's the part of the world that we want to belong to, that's the part of the world in which we trade with. Our economy is based on that. The Arab countries themselves, less than 7% of their trade is amongst themselves. We basically have very little economically in common with the region. What we do have in common with the region is geography. We're here. We're not in Europe. We're in Ireland, an island in the region, but we're here. And I'm not sure how much we will ever culturally mix with the region. There's no doubt in my mind there's a lot that we could do together to cooperate that would be mutually beneficial with all the countries in the region. They would benefit and we would benefit from that experience. I know as a person living in this country, I'm the oddball out who lives in Jerusalem and actually likes living in Jerusalem and would never want to live anywhere else. And the reason why I like living in Jerusalem is exactly because of the cultural diversity, which is, in my mind, what makes Jerusalem the most fascinating city in the world to live in. That fabric of multicultural, multi-ethnic groups, multi-religion, mostly everything, is what is a curse for Jerusalem because we never learned to celebrate the diversity, we learned to hate it. But if you can learn to celebrate the diversity, it's the most interesting place in the world to live. I think that we have a long way before we can teach Israelis and Palestinians to celebrate the blessing that we have of sharing this land. Today it's thought of as a curse. And it's thought of a curse because of exactly what happened in Gaza this last week. We're too busy killing each other to be able to reach out and appreciate each other. So I think it's a long way, and I think the road, unfortunately, perhaps, from your perspective, is political. First and foremost, we need political agreements to normalize relations between us at a political level that recognizes the political rights of the different peoples living in the region, particularly the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. And from there, we can reach out and go beyond and build the cultural links and the cultural understandings. I don't see a way that we can overcome the blockages that exist both psychologically and physically in terms of being able to reach out, talk to each other, connect. I lectured to a group of some 40 young Israelis who are in the final stages of their military service last night in Jerusalem. It was a really interesting meeting, and they were fascinated with what I had to say. And one of them said to me, how can we talk to them? Are there people to talk to? And I reminded people that, you know, it's a whole lot easier to do it today than it was when I started doing this work, when there wasn't even a fax machine. Facebook, my God, you just open up Facebook and send someone a message and ask to be their friend randomly. It doesn't matter who they are. Reach out and connect. Wasn't that the Nokia? Connecting people? There's so many ways to connect people today. And this is what I said to those young people who are about to finish their military service and are coming back to be civilians and want to make a political contribution, a social contribution to Israel. Reach out and text someone. There are lots of people in Machemar, like Machemar Abu Sadr in Gaza, who would be happy to call. I spent a lot of evenings these past 8 days calling friends in Gaza, just asking, how are you? Are you alive? How are you surviving this bombing? That using human contact is enough to change a person's orientation. So it starts at the political level, and it starts at the individuals making a decision that I'm not going to be passive. There are two things that we as civilians can do, and this is the answer to your question, is reach out and connect, and the other is don't be ignorant. Don't be ignorant. It's so easy to be ignorant. It's so comfortable to listen to the mantras and the messages that they pump into us every single time we open the radio or the television or open up our newspapers, even Haaretz. There are so many sources of information out there. What I tell everyone is don't believe anything you read. Nothing. Don't believe it all. Question it all. Put a question mark against everything that you read and check it with other sources. Verify it, compare, see what the different opinions are. It is so easy to do it today. And it's not that time consuming. But if you want to be a responsible citizen, do those two things. Don't be ignorant and reach out and touch someone.
Mark. Two questions, if I may. I assume that everyone in Tel Aviv, you hear voices, are very relieved that there is a ceasefire now. We heard of protests in the south. Do you have an assessment what's the general mood in the country? If people are happy with the ceasefire or actually predicted that the job wasn't done?
The immediate response from the poll that was published was that 70% of Israelis thought we ended too early. But I think that's the immediate response because they don't see the achievements. And every day that the ceasefire lasts, more and more people will say, thank God it's over. So I think this is a very fluid public opinion poll, and public opinion in Israel is extremely fluid. And I think we will see that trend as long as it remains quiet, as long as there are no more rockets, more and more people will say it was good that it ended when it did. You have a second follow-up?
Yes, but regarding this demand or the call that you said that there should be a slow political process, a rethinking of the approach toward Gaza and Hamas. And
not slow, it should be fast. We don't have time.
Yeah, but looking at political reality right now, it might be slower than we hope for. But also looking into the discussion about a two-state solution and putting Abbas and the West Bank back on the map. How do you think this plays out in the election campaign that is restarting now? Is that going to be an issue?
No, I don't think so. I think the social protest movement, which was born on this street over here, managed to put everyone to sleep on the political issue.
Even after this last week?
Even after this week, I think we're going to want to forget this week as fast as possible. This week will be an issue in the elections, but it won't be about making peace with Israel. It'll be issues on security. You know, they used to do public opinion research on Israel, looking at what issues were important to Israelis, and peace and security, as it was called, was always way at the top of the list. Well, the researchers, mostly from the Democracy Institute in Jerusalem, decided that it's not right to put the issue of peace and security together as one issue. So they asked Israelis again on the issue of peace and the issue of security. And security was way up, and peace was way down.
Gershon, about the religious aspects of all of this, you mentioned about how when Muhammad Jabri was like an ardent believer. I also heard this morning when they asked some Palestinians about the weight of the casualties, and they said, look, the Israelis had 6 fatalities. You had like 120 or so. So how can you consider being victorious in this? And he said, oh, these 120 are heading straight to paradise. And this was on BBC. So, I mean, we heard it in somebody saying that. And of course we heard the speaker today, who seems utterly secular and everything, but Hamas is religious. And we know from the way in our camp, if you are religious here in Israel, you are right-wing, you are against peace, you are against any compromise on the West Bank.
Not everyone.
Well, the vast majority. And I'm just wondering about there, you know, I mean, what's the weight from your experience between how much religion is being fed down their throat to the point that we're pretty much, you know,
lost. Look, I think that Muslims in general and Palestinian Muslims in particular would define themselves as believers, almost all of them. 99% of them would define themselves as believers. I think an overwhelming majority of them would consider themselves religious. The notion of reform Islam, like reform Judaism, doesn't really exist. There are different degrees of religiosity and observance. There's a tremendous amount of social pressure to not stray away from what's considered the norm. The best example of that is Ramadan. During the month of Ramadan, everyone fasts. You will almost never find anyone who will say that they don't fast. But I know a lot of people who are called, in Palestine, social fasters. Yani, we're fasting because we're in public. When we go home, we'll have our meal at home in quiet. No one will see us. No one will know. Do you fast? Alhamdulillah. That's the response. So there are these different trends as well, but religion is a central element of society in Palestine. It is, and it's very domineering. Clergy have a lot of influence.
Towards peace, towards reconciliation, or
usually not.
Is it like here?
In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority in the last 5 years has controlled the sermons in the mosques on every Friday. Every mosque in the West Bank gets once a week a page of what they're allowed to say and what they're not. Well, they don't get what they're not allowed to say, but they're basically given the sermon and what they're supposed to say in the mosque. That's controlled by the Palestinian Authority. You can call it lack of democracy, it is, but it was meant to fight incitement at a religious level, and it's controlled by the Palestinian Authority, which is actively fighting against terrorism and doing a good job of it.
It's trying to moderate the line, basically.
It's not trying to moderate the line, it's dictating the line. It has arrested clergy that don't adhere to the line. It has imprisoned clergy who are affiliated with Hamas and other movements. There are over 800 people affiliated with Hamas and Jihad in Palestinian Authority prisons. So this is a modern form of democracy, I suppose, but it's in a particular conflict context, which is aimed at making sure that terrorism doesn't emerge from the West Bank at all anymore. Listening to sermons from mosques in Gaza would make you want to die.
Can I just comment on
Riman
that?
Barkat is the Palestinian director of IPCRI. She's a Palestinian Muslim from Jerusalem.
But I just wanted to comment that also the issue of social status and the degree of poverty a lot of times has to do with how religious you are. And in Gaza, the sense of disparity, frustration, is always an incentive to become and to give up yourself and just to submit to some sort of leadership which claims that it has your fate in their hand.
The last sentence with regard to this question is that I believe that and I invite someone to do a PhD research on this, but I think there's a clear correlation both in Israel and in Palestine on two lines of religiosity and closeness to peace. And I contend that both in Israel and in Palestine, the further away we appear to be to peace, the more religious our societies become. Back in the 90s, when we were seemingly moving toward peace, Israel became less religious, and the same in Palestine. And because we're far away from peace, or we appear to be far away from peace in both societies, we have this growing power and trend toward religiosity.
Yes, please.
I haven't been to Gaza ever. I do travel a lot around the West Bank. And from what I see in the West Bank today, the reality, at least on the Israeli side, is that we're entrenching ourselves much more in the occupation. We see this with pushing Palestinians out of Area C, continuously building settlements or illegal outposts, and pushing Palestinians into Area A and Area B. Right? With that, like the aspiration or the hope of any two-state solution or any sort of solution is getting pushed away. And that I'd like to ask, and I do think the only solution is a two-state. I think it eventually will happen. As of today, there's no political will. So my question to you is, what do you think is more likely to happen? This tunnel that will be built between the West Bank and Gaza, right, will eventually connect West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem. Or maybe, I think, and I know this is my sense of what is more likely to happen, is to continue the siege in Gaza, connect Gaza into Egypt, and allow that to continue. What do you think is more?
Yeah, first I want to correct what I believe are lies perpetrated by the settlers and other people who are opposed. The more extreme settlers and those people who are opposed to peace on the basis of two-state solution. While it's true that there is a movement in certain parts of Area C to move Palestinians out, of the 2.5 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank, only 45,000 Palestinians live in Area C. So even moving a few hundred of them out, which is what's happening, doesn't change anything in reality. It changes everything for those individuals. But at a macro picture,
no annexing Area C.
No, there's an attempt, certainly by the settler movement, to push for more building settlements in Area C today. The total built-up areas of the settlements, the total built-up areas, not the areas they control, but the total built-up areas of the settlements, of all the settlements, is less than 5% of the West Bank. They control all of Area C, which is 62% of the West Bank. They control the whole road network, all the infrastructure, the economy, and etc. But the physical area on which they live is only 5% of the West Bank. They have unfortunately convinced most Palestinians that the Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza is no longer viable because of the settlements. That's a lie. Who said that their statutory borders that were decided by the civil administration have to be the legal statutory borders at the end of the day when we end up doing a territorial swap? So be careful about how we interpret reality. There's a physical reality on the ground, and there's a political reality that accompanies that, that's meant to confuse us and make us think that the two-state solution is no longer possible. It still is possible. So that's the first question. The second question, look, I don't know what's going to happen with Gaza right now. As far as I see it, Gaza is verging more and more into the Egyptian orbit, the Egyptian sphere of influence. I think that Gaza is going to start using the Egyptian lira, which would be a sign that the economy is moving into Egypt. It still uses the Israeli shekel as the main currency of trade in Gaza after all these years of not being under Israeli occupation or direct Israeli occupation. But I think this is going to happen. I think the establishment of a formal international border on Rafah, which will be not according to the agreement that was signed between Israel, Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, the United States, and the Quartet in 2005, which was called the Movement on Access and Movement, and the Rafah border crossing, which established that the Palestinian Authority forces of Mahmoud Abbas would run that border, and it would be monitored by European military people under a thing called UBAM, the United Nations border something management, border authority management, or monitoring body. So that agreement is dead, and we will have Hamas on one side and Egyptian personnel on the other side, and it will be an international border. This is going to create not the integration of Gaza into Egypt, because Egypt won't allow that, but it will create a Palestinian state in Gaza. And then the question comes, well, how do we deal with two Palestinian states? Maybe there won't be peace between the two Palestinian states. Maybe we could talk about the United States of Palestine. Maybe we can talk about a regime change in Gaza. Maybe the West Bank will be taken over by Hamas. My God, if we don't make peace with Mahmoud Abbas, and his regime falls apart, which it could happen, he's going to the United Nations. Israel is threatening to penalize the Palestinian Authority, working against our own best interest. There's nothing better for Israel's interest than the existence of the Palestinian Authority. We're about to cut off our nose to spite our face, because he's going to the UN to declare the two-state solution. On November, on the 29th of November, he's going to call for the implementation of the resolution, which called for the establishment of two states in Palestine, a Jewish state and an Arab state. That's what the resolution said. That's what's written in their Declaration of Independence. That's what Mahmoud Abbas is asking the world to support, and we're opposing that. The result of opposing that and penalizing him, and Steinitz and others who want to hold back the money, could lead to the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. And you know who's going to take over after Mahmoud Abbas? Hamas. And it doesn't have to. Hamas doesn't have anywhere near a majority of support. But in the absence of a viable, moderate regime in the West Bank, the radicals will take over.
Is there any way that's not going to happen? I mean, Israel...
Yeah, there's lots of ways that it's not going to happen. I'll give you, I can't help but being optimistic. I was born that way. I know it's a genetic defect. And it makes me think all kinds of things that some people think I'm hallucinating. But I'll give you my hallucination that I think is a very viable, possible reality. I think that on the day after elections in Israel, Barack Obama is going to call the newly elected prime minister, whose name is Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's going to say to him, Bibi, Iran is ours. We will not allow Iran to have a bomb. If we have to bomb Iran, we will bomb Iran. Iran will not have a bomb. That's an American guarantee. It's our problem, not yours. Now you focus your attention on Palestine. And I think that's the deal that the Americans are going to make with Bibi, and I think he's going to have a hard time not dealing with it. In addition to what Mechamer said and what other people said, one of my 4 meetings that I held with the Egyptian intelligence in Egypt the week before last was a discussion on what Egypt can do to help Israel make peace with the Palestinians. I didn't know that there was going to be a week later when Egypt helped us achieve a ceasefire, and President Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood stepped in personally to make that happen. But this is another possibility, that Egypt will get much more involved. Maybe we can revisit the Arab Peace Initiative. Maybe we can talk about a regional framework that would be much more beneficial for people like Netanyahu to think of than just to deal with Abu Mazen. So I think that there are other possibilities out there. I want to state something, and I'm not telling anyone in this room to vote for Bibi Netanyahu. I certainly won't. But from an Israeli point of view, there's no one better than Bibi Netanyahu to be the one to make peace with the Palestinians. That's a reality we should also think about as well. There's no one better than him to do it in terms of the ability to make a deal which is painful for Israelis and to keep Israel in one piece. Anyway, I think we should end now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. Whoever hasn't liked our page on Facebook, please do. We've actually grown by, I think, like 12 to 1,500 just during the week of, maybe a bit more. Like I think over the past 4 weeks, we've almost come to 2,000 new likes, and our page is there's a lot of action and discussion going on there, so please join in. And that's where you'll be able to learn about future Afternoons with IPCRI. Thank you very much for coming here, and see you soon.
I'm going from here now to Jerusalem, where I'm speaking to a group of 150 Bachurei Yeshiva from Shas. So, quite a different audience.
And I just want to say that Gershon said
Hamas suicidal wish.
Gershon said that he's a hallucinator, and yet last week or about 10 days ago he said that I'm even a greater hallucinator than he is. So we're still carrying the torch of it. Okay, thank you very much, guys. Bye.